Haunting of Blackthorn Estate by Marlowe Graves. Chapter 1. The Return. The world had burned, and with it the Blackthorn family. But when Lila Blackthorn returned to the estate, it was as if time had refused to acknowledge the fire that claimed everything. She stood on the edge of the overgrown path that led to the mansion, her heart a thundering drum against her chest. The smoke, the screams, the unbearable heat, they were all etched in her memory. And yet, as she stared at the towering silhouette of the mansion, there was no sign of the ruin, no trace of the devastation that had ravaged her world just weeks ago. The house was intact, unscathed. Lila didn't know whether to be relieved or terrified. The police had told her it was all gone, the mansion, the grounds, everything. They had searched the ashes for days, but only the charred remains of her family had been found. The fire had been swift, a merciless inferno that spared nothing, except, apparently, the house. Layla had received the call that morning, an anonymous tip about a fire on the property, a strange discovery. She didn't know what to think, but she couldn't ignore it. So, here she was, standing at the gates of Blackthorn Estate, staring at the house that was supposed to be nothing but rubble. It was a mockery of the truth. Lila hesitated. The estate had always been shrouded in darkness, long before the fire. Her family's history had been steeped in secrets, secrets that had often driven Lila away. She hadn't lived there in years, not since she turned 18 and fled the suffocating grip of Blackthorn's legacy. But this was different. This was something that didn't belong in the world she knew. And now, she had no choice but to confront it. With each step toward the mansion, her pulse quickened and an unsettling sensation crawled up her spine. It was as if the house itself was waiting for her, its shadows stretching and twisting in ways that didn't seem natural. The wind was still, the sky a bruised shade of gray, and there was no sound except the rustling of leaves beneath her boots. No birds, no distant hum of traffic. It was as if the world had been silenced, held in a breathless pause. Lila reached the front door, its heavy oak frame now untouched by fire. Her hand hovered over the brass knocker, cold to the touch, as though warning her not to proceed. But she pushed forward, her fingers curling around the handle and turning it with a faint creak. The door swung open. The air inside was stale, thick with a scent of dust and age. The familiar grandeur of the estate greeted her, its high ceilings and ornate chandeliers seemingly frozen in time. Nothing had changed. The grand staircase still stood, its mahogany banister gleaming beneath the dim light filtering through the tall windows. The marble floors were spotless, as if untouched by the flames that had ravaged everything outside. There was no sign of soot, no smell of smoke. It was as if the fire had never happened at all. Lila stepped inside, her footsteps echoing through the empty halls. The silence was suffocating, pressing in on her from all sides. The house, once filled with the laughter and warmth of family, now felt like a tomb. But there was something else, something she couldn't quite put her finger on. A presence, an energy that hung in the air, thick and oppressive, as if the house itself was watching her. She wandered through the grand foyer, her hand trailing along the walls, as though trying to ground herself in something familiar. She could feel the weight of her family's history pressing down on her, a history that she had long tried to escape. The Blackthorn name was one of privilege, power, and untold wealth, but it was also a name tainted by something far darker. Lila had always known there were secrets buried within these walls, secrets her parents had taken to their graves, but she had never cared to uncover them. Now she felt compelled to. She crossed the threshold into the drawing room, her gaze sweeping over the antique furniture that had once been the setting for many family gatherings. The grand piano sat untouched in the corner, its keys yellowed with age. A fire had always burned in the hearth, filling the room with warmth and light, but today the fire was absent. The shadows in the corners seemed to shift, moving in unnatural ways. Lila's breath caught in her throat as her eyes landed on the portrait that hung above the fireplace. It was of her family, her parents, her older brother, and herself, smiling as if they were a picture of happiness. But now, as she stared at it, something felt off. The faces, once full of life, seemed distorted, twisted in ways that made her skin crawl. Her brother's eyes, in particular, seemed to follow her every movement, and for a moment she felt as though he was watching her from beyond the canvas. A chill ran down her spine. She turned away quickly, shaking off the sensation. It was just her imagination, her mind playing tricks on her. She hadn't slept properly since the fire, hadn't been able to shake the memories of that night, of the smoke choking the life out of her family, of the feeling of helplessness as the flames consumed everything. Her gaze shifted to the hallway beyond the drawing room. She could hear the faint sound of something scraping against the floor like the soft shuffle of footsteps. But when she looked, there was nothing. The house was still as it had been since she entered. Her pulse quickened. Something was wrong. She wasn't alone. As the darkness in the corner seemed to stretch further, Lila made her way toward the staircase, her every step heavy with the weight of the past. The house seemed to pulse around her, as if it had come alive, its creaks and groans telling stories of things long buried, things she wasn't ready to face. But she had to. She had to understand what was happening here. The fire hadn't been the end. It had only been the beginning. And as she ascended the stairs, she couldn't shake the feeling that whatever waited for her at the top was far worse than any fire. Chapter 2. Beneath the Surface. The second floor of Blackthorn Estate felt even colder than the rest of the house. The grand staircase had led her up to a long, narrow hallway, lined with closed doors that seemed to be guarding their secrets. The floorboards creaked under her weight as she walked, the sound sharp and unnerving in the silence. Each room she passed was untouched, preserved in the same eerie stillness as the rest of the mansion. There were no signs of fire damage here, no remnants of destruction, only dust. Everything was so perfectly in place that it was as though her family had simply vanished. Leila stopped in front of the door to her old room. The brass doorknob gleamed faintly in the low light, and for a moment she felt the weight of the years she had spent away. She hadn't stepped foot inside this room since she was a teenager, long before the fire, long before the distance between her and her family had grown too great. Her pulse fluttered in her throat. She didn't know why, but the thought of stepping inside made her stomach twist in a way that felt like dread. Her hand shook as she grasped the doorknob, twisting it slowly. The door swung open with a soft groan, revealing a room that was unchanged, almost disturbingly so. The walls were lined with old, faded wallpaper that had once been a soft lavender, but had long since dulled to an almost gray hue. The canopy bed sat beneath a window that was slightly ajar, its curtains fluttering lightly in the breeze. There was a faint smell of old perfume in the air, a scent that reminded her of her childhood, of innocence lost long ago. But there was something else. A strange unease settled in her chest as her eyes flicked across the room. The room wasn't just unchanged, it was too still, too perfect, as if someone had carefully dusted and rearranged it just for her return. There were no personal touches, no memories scattered around like the remnants of a life once lived here. It was as though this room had been waiting for her, just as the rest of the house had. Lila stepped inside, her feet sinking slightly into the thick carpet. Her gaze landed on the vanity across the room, where a small mirror rested, its surface cloudy with age. But it wasn't the dust or the mirror that caught her attention. It was the photograph on the vanity, a picture of her family, a snapshot from a much happier time. Her parents, her brother and her, smiling for the camera, all of them looking so carefree. But as she stepped closer to the vanity, something about the picture seemed off. Her breath hitched as she leaned in. Her brother's face in the photograph seemed unnaturally pale, his eyes dark and hollow, like they were staring at her from the depths of the frame. She could feel her heart racing, a tightness creeping into her chest. The photo hadn't been there before. She was sure of it. It hadn't been there the last time she had come into this room. Shaking her head, she turned away from the vanity and looked around the rest of the room. Her eyes landed on a small wooden chest at the foot of her bed. It was old, very old. She had never seen it before. She had no memory of it ever being here, yet its presence felt strangely familiar, as though it belonged. Lila approached the chest cautiously, kneeling before it. She ran her fingers over the worn edges, the wood smooth beneath her touch. She had to know what was inside. Without another thought, she lifted the heavy lid. Inside, there was nothing but darkness. The chest was empty. But as she stared into the blackness, the air around her seemed to shift. The shadows in the corners of the room deepened, curling like tendrils that reached out to grasp her. A sudden chill swept through the room, sending a shiver down her spine. It was as if the house itself was breathing, its presence pressing in on her, suffocating her. Lila slammed the chest shut, her heart pounding in her ears. She stood up quickly, backing away from it, her breath coming in shallow gasps. The room felt wrong, too wrong. Then she heard it. A soft whisper. It was faint at first, barely audible, like the rustling of dry leaves. But it grew louder, clearer, and as it did, Lila felt a surge of panic rise in her chest. She turned toward the sound, her eyes scanning the room for its source. There was no one here. No one. The whisper came again. Lila. Her name, spoken softly, as if from just behind her. She spun around, but the room was empty. Her pulse quickened. She could feel her hands trembling, her mind racing, but she refused to believe what was happening. She had to focus, had to stay calm. Lila stepped back to the door, pulling it open and rushing into the hallway, desperate for air. She slammed the door behind her, but the unease remained, clinging to her like a shadow. As she stumbled down the hallway, her eyes caught movement at the end of the corridor. It was brief, just a flicker in the corner of her vision, but it was enough to freeze her in place. Someone had moved, someone or something was there, watching her. Lila. The voice came again, and this time it was closer, much closer. Lila's heart raced as her body froze in place. She didn't dare turn around. She couldn't, but she could feel it. Feel the presence behind her. The thing that had been watching her since she entered the house. With a burst of panic, she sprinted down the hallway, not caring where she was going, just needing to get away. The footsteps behind her were silent, but she could feel them echoing in her mind, chasing her. The walls seemed to close in around her, pressing down like a vice, suffocating her with their weight. She ran until she reached the end of the hallway, where a door stood slightly ajar. It led to the attic, a place she had never dared to enter as a child. But now, in her desperation, it seemed like the only option. She didn't even hesitate. Lila slammed the door open and stepped into the dark, cramped space, her breath ragged in her chest. She glanced over her shoulder, half expecting to see someone or something there, but there was nothing. The house was silent once more. But she couldn't shake the feeling. She was being watched, and whatever it was, it had been waiting for her. Chapter 3. The Truth Beneath the Floorboards. The attic was far darker than Lila had anticipated. A heavy, oppressive darkness swallowed the room whole, as though the shadows had gathered here over centuries, waiting for her. The air felt thick and stale, carrying the scent of old wood, dust, and something unfamiliar. something that made her skin crawl. Lila took cautious steps forward, her footsteps echoing in the stillness. The only light came from the faint sliver of moonlight that crept through the single grime-covered window at the far end. Her breath came out in soft puffs as she moved deeper into the attic, eyes scanning the room. Old furniture was stacked in haphazard piles. Chairs with broken legs, a few old trunks that appeared to have been untouched for years, and what looked like the skeletal remains of a rocking horse, its paint chipped and faded. None of it seemed familiar to her. But there was something else in the room, something that gnawed at the edges of her mind, something she couldn't place. Her gaze shifted to the far corner of the attic, where a large wooden chest sat. Unlike the others, it wasn't covered in dust. Its surface gleamed as though someone had recently polished it, as if someone had been waiting for her to find it. The chest stood on its own, isolated from the rest of the clutter, and though it looked ordinary at first glance, a sense of foreboding crept over her as she approached it. The whispering voice came again, just a faint murmur at first, but it grew louder in her ears, like a low hum beneath her skull. She could feel it vibrating in her chest, making her heart race. Lila. The voice had an edge now, urgent, almost pleading. She froze, her hand hovering over the chest, a strange compulsion pulling her toward it. A part of her knew she shouldn't open it, but the other part, the part of her that had been seeking answers ever since she arrived, couldn't resist. With trembling hands, Lila lifted the lid. Inside there were no valuables, no long-forgotten family heirlooms, only a collection of old, brittle papers, yellowed with age. She picked up the first sheet, careful not to tear it, and squinted at the faded ink. The writing was almost illegible, but the few words she could make out made her heart lurch in her chest. The fire is not the end, only the beginning. They never left. They are still here, watching, waiting. Come home, Lila. Come home before it's too late. Her blood ran cold. She dropped the paper back into the chest and quickly closed the lid, her breathing ragged as she backed away, but the unease wouldn't leave her. There was something profoundly wrong with that message, something that spoke of things she wasn't ready to understand. Suddenly the room seemed even darker. The shadows were moving, warping around her, closing in like they had a life of their own. A faint creaking sound filled the air, as though the very floorboards beneath her were groaning under the weight of something far too heavy. Lila spun around, her heart pounding as she tried to make sense of the disorienting atmosphere that seemed to shift around her. She was no longer alone. In the corner of the attic, near the window, she saw a figure. It was a silhouette, tall and thin, standing perfectly still. At first, she thought it might have been a trick of the light, but then it moved. The figure stepped forward, its footsteps making no sound against the floor. The air turned colder, and Lila's breath caught in her throat as she instinctively stepped back. "Who are you?" Her voice trembled, but she knew the figure couldn't answer. It wasn't real, couldn't be. She was just imagining things. But the longer she stared at it, the more real it became. The figure was dressed in dark clothing, its face obscured by shadows, but she could feel its eyes on her. "Leela," the voice whispered again, this time echoing in the back of her mind. The same voice that had followed her since the moment she stepped into the house. "You shouldn't have come back. They're waiting for you. All of them. Waiting to finish what they started." Lila's breath quickened. The walls felt like they were closing in on her, suffocating her with their presence. The figure in the corner seemed to pulse with darkness, and the whispering voice grew louder, clearer. "Who are they? What do you want from me?" She cried out, her voice desperate, her fear rising like a tide. The figure remained silent, but as she looked closer, she saw something that made her stomach drop. There were small, faint scratches along the edge of the figure's cloak, long, thin lines that seemed to shimmer in the dim light. Her mind raced to make sense of them. Her hands began to shake as a memory began to surface, one she had buried deep within herself, so deep that she had almost forgotten it. When she was younger, she had played a game with her brother, Oliver, here in the attic. They used to pretend the floorboards were hiding treasure, or worse, hidden secrets of the mansion. One day they had discovered a section of the floor that creaked unnaturally, a soft, hollow sound when they stepped on it. They had pried it open, only to find a small, strange box hidden beneath the boards. The box was old, made of tarnished metal and locked tight. Lila hadn't thought much of it at the time. They had tried to open it, but it wouldn't budge. Oliver had said it was better left alone. The memory hit her like a punch to the gut. The attic, the box, the scratches on the figure's cloak. She suddenly realized that it wasn't just the figure she had seen in the corner of the room. It was her. Lila's breath caught in her throat. The figure was her. The figure stepped forward again, its movements slow and deliberate. The shadows in the room seemed to thicken, swirling around her in an almost tangible way, like they were alive. She wanted to run, but her legs wouldn't move. The fear had paralyzed her, locked her in place, unable to escape. "Come home, Layla," the voice urged once more, this time coming from every direction at once. "They never left, and neither have you." A sudden gust of cold wind rushed through the attic, blowing the dust and papers around her like a storm. As the wind swirled, the figure began to fade, melting into the shadows, leaving behind only the faint echo of its voice. Layla stood frozen in the center of the room, her heart racing as the darkness around her thickened. There was no escape, not anymore. The house was alive. It was alive, and it had been waiting for her. Slowly, as the wind died down, she knelt down to the floorboards, her hands trembling as she pried them apart. She had to know what lay beneath. There was something in this house, something she wasn't ready to face, but there was no turning back now. The floorboards creaked as they gave way, and there, hidden deep in the earth beneath Blackthorn Estate, she found the truth. Chapter 4: The Unseen Truth. Lila's hands trembled as she pried up the last of the floorboards, her heart hammering in her chest. The attic around her was eerily silent now, the oppressive darkness pressing in on her from all sides. The figure had vanished, leaving behind only the chill of its presence. But the feeling that she was not alone, that something was watching her, lingered like a heavy fog. Her fingers brushed the cool, damp earth beneath the floorboards, and there, nestled in the dark cavity, was something solid. A small, rectangular box, old and covered in dirt, its surface cracked and tarnished. It was the same box she had imagined so many years ago, when she and Oliver had stumbled upon it during their childhood game. The memories flooded back in a rush. Oliver's laugh, the excitement in their eyes as they believed they had discovered some ancient treasure. But that was before the fire, before the house had become a graveyard of charred memories. Lila pulled the box free, wiping away the layers of dust and dirt. It was heavier than she remembered, its weight odd and unsettling. She looked around the attic, as if the shadows themselves were watching her, waiting for her to open it. But a voice, her own voice, echoed in her mind, a warning she had forgotten until now. "Don't open it. Never open it." Her heart raced at the thought. She had heard that voice before, hadn't she? It was the same voice she had heard in the attic, the same whisper that had come from the shadows. She swallowed hard, her grip tightening around the box. There was no going back now. She had already come too far. With a sharp breath, she lifted the latch, the rusted metal scraping against the box as if it had not been touched in decades. Inside, nestled in velvet-lined fabric, was a small, delicate object. It looked like a locket, a tarnished silver locket, its surface etched with intricate patterns that seemed to shimmer in the dim light. Lila's breath caught in her throat as she reached for it, her fingers brushing against its cool surface. The locket felt strange in her hands, almost as if it were alive. She hesitated for a moment, her instincts screaming at her to leave it alone, but she couldn't resist. Slowly, she opened the locket, her fingers trembling. Inside, there was a photograph, a faded black and white image of a family. Lila's heart skipped a beat as she stared at the photograph. The faces were blurry and indistinct, but there was something about them that seemed familiar. She leaned in closer, trying to make out the features. A man, a woman, and two children. The children were around the same age she had been when the fire destroyed the estate. Her eyes darted to the woman in the photograph. She looked strikingly similar to her, same dark hair, same high cheekbones. And the man beside her, he resembled her father, though his face was distorted by time and age. But it was the children who caught her attention the most. The boy in the picture, the one with the dark eyes and mischievous grin, looked so much like Oliver. A cold wave of realization crashed over Lila. This wasn't just any family portrait. This was her family. Her real family. Her breath hitched in her throat as she snapped the locket shut, her hand shaking violently. There was something horribly wrong with this. Her parents had died in the fire. She had seen their charred bodies in the ruins of the mansion. And Oliver, her dear, sweet brother, had perished too, a victim of the same cruel fate. But the photograph contradicted everything she thought she knew. She sat back on the floor, her mind whirling with questions she couldn't answer. Why didn't I remember this? Why didn't I know about this picture? A faint sound from the far end of the attic caught her attention, almost like a whisper. Lila's head snapped up, her heart pounding in her chest. She stood quickly, clutching the box to her chest, her eyes scanning the darkened corners of the room. The whispering grew louder, more insistent now. A voice, faint, like a distant echo, called to her again. Lila. It was the same voice from before, the voice that had haunted her from the moment she stepped foot in the mansion. But this time, it was different. The voice wasn't just a whisper anymore. It was calling to her from inside her mind, an intrusive thought that demanded her attention. She took a tentative step forward, her breath shallow. Who is it? She whispered, her voice barely audible, as though speaking aloud would shatter the fragile silence of the attic. Come closer. The voice came again, stronger now, and with it the shadows in the room seemed to stretch and writhe, as if alive. Her eyes locked on the far corner of the attic, where the darkness seemed to pulse and shift like a living thing. And then, through the haze of blackness, she saw it, a figure standing still as if waiting for her. Lila's pulse quickened. It was the same figure from before, the one she had seen in the shadows. It was tall, gaunt, its form almost too thin to be human. The figure was dressed in dark, tattered clothing, and its face was obscured by shadows, but the outline of its hollow eyes glowed faintly in the dark. Her body froze. The figure wasn't moving, but its presence was suffocating, as though it were pulling her in, demanding her attention. And for the first time since she had arrived at Blackthorn Estate, Lila felt a deep sense of dread, real, tangible fear that rooted her to the spot. I don't understand, she whispered, her voice cracking. What do you want from me? The figure didn't answer, but then slowly, as if it were reaching out to her, it raised one thin arm and pointed toward the far wall of the attic. Lila's eyes followed the gesture, her heart hammering in her chest as she gazed at the wall. At first, she saw nothing unusual, just peeling wallpaper, cracked wood, and the remnants of what had once been an elegant space. But then something caught her eye, a faint outline, a shape hidden beneath the layers of dust and decay. Her hand shook as she reached for the wall, her fingers brushing against the cold surface. She pushed gently, and the wall shifted, revealing a hidden door, a narrow, wooden door that had been concealed for years. With trembling hands, she opened it, the hinges creaking in protest. Beyond the door was a staircase leading down into the darkness below. A part of her screamed to turn back. The house was filled with too many secrets, too many unanswered questions. But another part, something dark and primal, urged her forward. She had to know the truth. She had to uncover what lay beneath the floorboards, beneath the walls of Blackthorn Estate. As she descended the stairs, the air grew colder, and the darkness seemed to press in around her. Every step felt heavier, as if the weight of the mansion itself was pulling her deeper into its heart. And then, just as she reached the bottom of the stairs, she heard it again, the voice, clearer now, coming from the depths of the darkness. Welcome home, Lila. Chapter 5. Beneath the Surface. The darkness swallowed Lila whole as she descended the narrow staircase. The air was thick with the scent of damp stone and the musty decay of a place forgotten by time. Each step creaked under her weight, echoing through the hollow space as if the mansion itself was listening, waiting for her next move. The farther she descended, the colder it came. Her breath formed small clouds of vapor in the frigid air, and a shiver ran down her spine. The staircase seemed to stretch endlessly downward, each step taking her further into the heart of the mansion, a place untouched by the world above. She had never known this part of Blackthorn Estate existed. It was as though it had been buried on purpose, hidden away, locked behind time itself. At last, her foot touched the bottom step, and she found herself standing in a small, dimly lit chamber. The only source of light came from an old, rusted lantern hanging from the ceiling, its flame flickering weakly, casting eerie shadows across the walls. The room was small, but every inch of it seemed laden with secrets. Objects, forgotten and covered in dust, littered the floor and the edges of the room. Lila's eyes scanned the space, and her breath hitched when she saw the first sign of something out of place, a large, ornate mirror standing against the far wall. The glass was cracked, and its surface was streaked with grime, but something about it seemed wrong. The frame, intricately carved with twisted vines and snarling faces, appeared to pulse with an unnatural energy, as if it were alive, breathing in sync with her own heartbeat. Her hand instinctively reached out, but she stopped herself just before her fingers touched the cold surface. The voice from earlier, the same voice that had beckoned her here, whispered in her mind again. Don't touch it. Lila's breath caught in her throat. She wasn't sure if the warning came from her own fear or from something far older, far more sinister. But the voice was insistent, and deep down, she knew it wasn't her imagination. The mirror held something, something she couldn't yet comprehend. Instead of approaching the mirror, she turned her attention to the rest of the room. There were old crates piled against the walls, their contents buried beneath thick layers of dust and cobwebs. In one corner, an ancient rocking chair swayed ever so slightly, as if someone had just gotten up. The hairs on the back of her neck stood on end, but she forced herself to ignore the growing sense of unease gnawing at her. She moved toward one of the crates, her heart thudding in her chest. As she lifted the lid, the air seemed to grow even colder. The crate was filled with yellowed papers and old, brittle books, artifacts of a past long forgotten. But as she sifted through the contents, something caught her eye. A leather-bound journal, its edges worn and frayed with age. She pulled it free from the clutter and opened it to the first page. The handwriting was elegant, precise, and unmistakably familiar. September 18th, 1924. I have begun the descent into madness. The whispers grow louder each night, calling my name, urging me to follow them into the darkness. I have seen them, shadows, figures, moving just out of sight. The house is alive with their presence. I fear that I am not alone in this place. The others, the ones who came before me, have already lost themselves. I see their faces in the mirrors, their eyes pleading for release. But I cannot escape. Not now. I have heard it. The voice. It promises to show me the truth. But the truth, it is a lie. The words stopped her cold. The journal. Who had written this? Her pulse quickened as she turned the pages, desperate for more. The entries grew more frantic with each passing day, each more disturbing than the last. The writer spoke of shadows in the house, voices that drove people to madness, and the ever-present feeling that something was watching, waiting. Lila's eyes widened as she reached the final entry. November 5th, 1924. It is here. I can feel it in the walls, in the floors, in the air I breathe. It calls to me, this thing that lives beneath Blackthorn Estate. The fire will be my salvation, but it is not the end. It is the beginning. There are others who will come after me, and they will face the same fate. The mansion will claim them all, and then it will claim me. Lila's hand shook as she closed the journal. Her thoughts were a whirlwind. This wasn't just some forgotten artifact, it was a warning. The fire, the destruction, the loss of life, it wasn't a random tragedy. It was a part of something far darker, far more calculated. The fire had not been an accident. It had been a way to bury the truth, to silence those who had come before. But the truth could not be buried. It had returned, and now was her turn. A sudden, sharp noise broke through the thick silence of the room. Lila jumped, her heart racing as she spun around, searching for the source. She saw nothing. The room was still, but the air felt heavy, charged with a malevolent energy. And then, like a jolt of electricity, she heard it. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming from behind her. The temperature dropped. The light from the lantern flickered and then went out, plunging the room into complete darkness. Lila! The voice came again, closer now, almost as if it were right beside her. But she couldn't move. She was paralyzed with fear. She couldn't breathe, couldn't think. The shadows seemed to stretch around her, wrapping her in an inescapable grip. You should not have come here. Lila's breath came in ragged gasps, but she forced herself to speak. Who are you? She whispered, her voice trembling in the dark. There was no answer, only the sound of heavy breathing. And then, from the darkness, a figure stepped forward. It was a man, or at least it had been once. His face was gaunt, hollow, and his eyes were completely black, devoid of any emotion or life. Lila stumbled backward, her heart thundering in her chest. The figure reached out, his hand twitching with unnatural speed. You are too late, it whispered, its voice a rasping, tortured sound. The mansion has already claimed you. Lila couldn't think, couldn't move. The figure was almost upon her, and she knew deep down that she had made a grave mistake by coming here. With a desperate cry, she turned and ran, her feet pounding against the cold stone floor, her pulse thundering in her ears. She could hear the figure behind her, the sound of its footsteps growing louder, faster, as if it were gaining on her. She didn't stop. She couldn't stop. The dark hallway seemed to stretch on forever, but eventually she saw the faint glow of light ahead. The staircase. The way out. But as she reached it, she heard the whisper again, colder, more insistent. You cannot escape. And then the door slammed shut in front of her with a deafening bang, sealing her fate. Layla was trapped. Chapter 6. The Screaming Walls. Lila's heart pounded against her ribs, her breath ragged in her chest as she pressed her back to the cold stone wall. She had reached the stairwell, the fleeting hope of escape still clinging to her. But the door, she had no idea what force had sealed it shut, nor how to open it again. The air felt dense, as if it were constricting around her, pressing in from all sides. The darkness seemed to suffocate her, amplifying the sound of her frantic breathing. She slammed her fists against the door, her nails scraping against the rough wood. "Let me out. Please let me out," she screamed, her voice hoarse with desperation. But the only reply was the oppressive silence, thick and suffocating. Turning around, her mind racing with terror, Lila's eyes swept over the chamber she had just fled. The mirror, the crates, the rocking chair. She could hear them all again, the whispers, low and mocking, swirling through the room like a vortex, pulling her towards something she couldn't yet comprehend. The floor creaked beneath her feet, and as her gaze drifted across the shadow-filled room, she saw it, a figure in the corner, standing still, staring at her with hollow eyes. Its shape was indistinct at first, but as she focused, the outline became clearer. It was a woman, but not a woman in the way Lila understood it. Her figure seemed to ripple with the shadows, as if her very form was something caught between two worlds, flickering in and out of reality. Lila stumbled backward, a choked gasp escaping her lips. "Who are you?" she demanded, but her voice came out shaky, strained. "What do you want from me?" The figure didn't move at first, but its eyes, those deep, dark eyes, never left hers. Then, the woman's lips parted, and the air around her seemed to vibrate with a strange resonance. "Help me!" The words were soft, but the weight of them settled on Lila like a physical force, pushing her down into the depths of despair. It wasn't a plea for sympathy, it was a command, a cold, unyielding demand that reverberated through Lila's bones. "Help you? How? How can I help you?" Lila whispered, her voice barely audible. The figure raised one hand, pointing toward the far corner of the room where the cracked mirror stood, its frame now glimmering faintly in the dark. The shadowy woman's voice rang out once more, but this time it was not her lips that moved. It was the very walls, the house itself, that spoke. "The truth is inside." The temperature in the room dropped sharply, the sudden cold making Lila's breath catch in her throat. Her skin prickled with an icy chill that crept under her clothes, sinking into her flesh. The shadows seemed to stretch toward her, moving with unnatural intent. She felt as though the very walls of the mansion were alive, closing in around her, suffocating her with their weight. The air grew thick, cloying with the scent of something ancient, something wrong. Lila felt her legs go weak beneath her, but she fought to stay on her feet. She couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't shake the feeling that something had been waiting for her. Something that had always been waiting in the deep recesses of this house, beneath the layers of fire and ash. She glanced at the mirror again, the figure in the corner still watching her with those eyes that seemed to know her, know everything about her. The house, it seemed, had a memory of its own, and it remembered her. Without thinking, her legs moved toward the mirror, the compulsion to see what lay beyond its fractured surface overpowering any lingering hesitation. The whispers swirled around her, growing louder with every step, until they became a chorus of voices all shouting at once. The cold air surrounded her, drawing her closer to the mirror, to whatever truth it held. When her hand hovered just inches from the glass, Leela hesitated. The voice, calm and terrifying, spoke again, this time not in the shadows of the house, but directly in her mind. "Look." Lila's heart raced as her fingers brushed against the mirror's cracked surface. The glass was cold to the touch, sending a shudder of ice down her spine. The fractured reflection that stared back at her wasn't hers. It was a woman, a younger version of herself, standing in front of the mansion, her face unscarred by time and tragedy. Her eyes, wide and innocent, held a look of terror as she gazed at the very mansion Layla now stood within. Lila's breath caught in her throat, her body frozen as the reflection in the mirror seemed to come alive. The woman's mouth moved, as though speaking, but no sound emerged. Instead, the reflection seemed to vibrate with some hidden energy, the woman's image warping and twisting as the cracks in the mirror began to spread outward. It wasn't supposed to happen like this. The words were clear now, though the reflection of her younger self did not speak them aloud. Lila understood them in her bones. You weren't supposed to come back. A wave of nausea hit her like a physical blow. The reflection in the mirror reached out toward her, her hand sliding through the glass, as though the surface had become liquid. Lila recoiled, her mind racing with terror and confusion. She stumbled back, but as her feet skidded on the cold stone, the room seemed to shift. The walls groaned, stretching and creaking as if the mansion itself was alive, bending and warping to her will. The air thickened, and the whispers grew louder, maddening. They all shouted in unison, their voices rising in pitch, becoming deafening, unbearable. And then, with a sickening lurch, the floor beneath her gave way. Lila cried out, but there was no sound as she plummeted into darkness. Her body hit the ground hard, the world spinning, the impact rattling her bones. She lay there, stunned, her head swimming as the cold seeped into her skin. But the whispers didn't stop. They followed her, echoing through the darkness. You should not have come. The darkness pressed in on her from all sides, suffocating, until at last Layla found her voice. I have to find the truth, she gasped into the silence. I have to understand. The ground beneath her shuddered, and the shadows stretched toward her again, this time more insistent, as if the house itself was trying to drag her down into its depths. A single thought coursed through her mind, sharp and clear. The truth isn't what you think it is. And then, just as the darkness closed in, the whispering stopped. For a moment, everything was silent. But the silence was worse. The silence was a promise of something far worse to come. Chapter 7. Beneath the Ashes. Lila's eyes fluttered open, and she gasped as her body jolted upward, heart racing. The air was thick with dust, and her limbs ached as though she had been lying still for hours. The room was bathed in a dim, sickly light, the source unclear. She felt disoriented, as if she had just emerged from a nightmare that hadn't quite finished haunting her. The coldness that clung to her skin seemed to press in, constricting her chest. For a moment, she couldn't remember where she was. The house, the burning fire, the shadowy figure, and the mirror all seemed to blur together in a fog of confusion. Slowly, the memories began to resurface, fragmented, sharp-edged. She was in the basement. The floor beneath her was cold and uneven, made of cracked stone. The walls, lined with old wooden beams, seemed to groan and whisper. Layla struggled to sit up fully, but a wave of dizziness swept over her, and she placed her hand on the floor to steady herself. Her fingers brushed something warm and wet, and when she pulled her hand back, she saw blood. Her stomach lurched, but there was no pain, just blood. The basement had once been a place of storage, a forgotten part of the estate. Now, it felt like the maw of some ancient beast waiting to swallow her whole. It smelled of mildew, old wood, and something else, something metallic, like iron. The shadows pressed in around her. They clung to the corners, curling and shifting with unnatural intent. Her senses were heightened now. Every creak of the house, every subtle rustle in the air, magnified in her mind. It felt like the house was alive, as though it were breathing with her. She glanced around, searching for any signs of the figure she'd seen earlier, but there was nothing. just the eerie silence. Nothing but the thick, suffocating air and the faint hum of something that sounded like whispers far in the distance. Standing up slowly, Lila felt the weight of the moment settle over her. This place, this house, was holding secrets it didn't want to let go of. It had buried them deep beneath layers of ash and history, and she was here to uncover them. But at what cost? Her footstep echoed in the empty basement, and she found herself drawn toward a far corner, where a darkened doorway beckoned her. She had seen this door before, but something about it seemed different now. There was a heaviness in the air around it, a palpable energy that made her skin crawl. Leela approached the door, her pulse quickening with each step. She could hear the faint sound of something moving behind it, scratching, faint tapping, as though whatever was hidden there was just as desperate to be freed as she was to escape. The whispers that had followed her earlier seemed to grow louder again, coiling around her thoughts like a vice. With trembling hands, she gripped the door handle and pulled. The door creaked loudly as it opened, revealing a narrow staircase that descended deeper into the bowels of the mansion. The darkness at the bottom of the stairs seemed endless, like an abyss that swallowed everything. Lila hesitated. Was it a trap? Could it be another test of some kind, another twisted game the house was playing with her mind? But then the whispers came again, not soft this time, but clear and insistent. Come. It was a command, not a suggestion. Lila swallowed hard, her breath hitching in her throat. She couldn't turn back now. She had already come this far. If she was going to find the truth, she had no choice but to descend further into the depths of the Blackthorn estate. Her hand still shaking, she stepped onto the first stair. The air around her thickened as she descended. The temperature dropped, and the dampness in the walls seemed to seep into her bones. She reached the bottom, her feet sinking into the dirt-covered floor, and as she stepped further into the room, she felt the heavy, almost oppressive weight of something ancient pressing down on her. The basement was far larger than she had expected, the space stretching out in front of her like some hidden chamber lost to time. Wooden crates, some broken and splintered, were stacked haphazardly in one corner. Old furniture, long abandoned, stood in the shadows, their forms covered in layers of dust, and in the very center of the room stood a large, rusted iron door. The whispers had stopped, but the air still hummed with tension. Lila's instincts screamed at her to leave, but there was something in the pit of her stomach that told her she was close. Whatever the house had hidden here, whatever dark truth it had buried beneath its stone foundations, was just beyond that door. The rusted metal glistened under the dim light, its surface scarred with the marks of age and neglect. As she approached, she noticed something written on the door, carved into the iron with deep, jagged scratches. "Don't open." Lila felt the chill run through her spine at the sight of the warning. The letters, uneven and frenzied, seemed to pulse with an energy of their own, as if whatever had been written there had been scratched in a desperate plea for someone to heed the warning. But it was too late now. Her curiosity had already been piqued, and the need for answers outweighed the fear gnawing at her. Lila reached for the handle, her fingers cold as they closed around it. The moment she touched it, the air seemed to shift, thickening, swirling. Her breath hitched as she turned the knob, the sound of metal scraping against metal reverberating through the room. The door creaked open, revealing a narrow corridor that stretched into complete darkness. But in the far distance, just beyond the reach of the dim light, she saw a faint glow. It was barely perceptible, but it was there, flickering like a dying flame. Lila stepped forward, drawn into the corridor like a moth to a flame. The silence around her was oppressive, and every step seemed to reverberate through the walls. The deeper she went, the more the temperature dropped, until she could see her breath clouding in front of her. As she neared the light, she saw something else, a figure standing motionless in the center of the glowing room. It was a man, but not a man as she would have expected. His eyes were hollow, empty black sockets that seemed to swallow her whole as she stared into them. His skin was pale, unnaturally so, and his mouth stretched into a grotesque, lifeless smile. The man didn't move, but the air around him seemed to pulse with a strange energy. Lila took another step closer, her heart racing. And then, just as she reached out to touch him, the figure crumbled to dust. It was gone, just like that, vanishing in an instant, leaving behind nothing but the faint smell of burning ash. Lila froze, her body locking in place as the temperature in the room plummeted further until it felt like the very air around her was suffocating her. The whispers came again, louder now, more urgent. "It's too late. You should have left." And then, from the corner of the room, the truth began to surface. The darkness itself seemed to stir, reshaping, revealing a hidden past long buried beneath the house's crumbling walls. The horrors that had been locked away were no longer content to stay hidden. Lila had crossed the point of no return. Chapter 8: The Unraveling. The darkness swelled around Lila, pressing in on all sides like a living entity. It felt as though the very walls of the mansion had begun to close in on her, suffocating her with their weight. The air was thick, dense with something ancient and malicious, a presence that made her skin crawl and her heartbeat race faster. She staggered back, her breath coming in shallow gasps, but the whispers didn't stop. They were louder now, echoing through her mind, crawling into her thoughts like a sickness. Her eyes darted around the room, trying to find a way out, but all she could see was the suffocating darkness and the faint glow that flickered in the distance. It's too late. You're already part of it. The words whispered inside her skull, and she clutched her head as though trying to drown them out. The weight of the mansion seemed to press against her temples, as if it were trying to crush her. She wanted to scream, to run, but her body refused to obey. Her eyes fell back to the spot where the figure had been, where the man had been, the one who had crumbled to dust before her eyes. All that remained was the faintest wisp of smoke, curling and disappearing into the air. But something had changed in the room. There in the corner was a figure, a shadow in the dim light. It was crouched low, just out of her direct line of sight, but she could feel it watching her, waiting. A chill swept through her body, and instinctively, Lila knew that this was not the same presence that had vanished moments before. No, this was something far worse. A low, rasping breath filled the air, and Lila's heart seemed to freeze in her chest. The whispers grew louder, more urgent. "Don't turn around. Don't face it." But her body betrayed her, and against every ounce of her being, her head slowly turned. At first, she saw nothing, just the shifting darkness. But as her gaze adjusted, she saw the outline of a figure standing in the corner. It was tall, unnaturally so, its silhouette warped and twisted as if it were not entirely bound by the laws of reality. Lila's breath caught in her throat as the shadow moved, its form stretching and contracting, like a monstrous creature that was not quite there, but not entirely gone either. The light flickered again, casting strange shapes across its body. Its face, or what could be mistaken for a face, was a void, a featureless mask of blackness that seemed to absorb all light, all hope. Then came the sound, a low growl that vibrated in the pit of her stomach like a wild animal, something primal and furious. The creature's gaze, or what could be called a gaze, shifted toward her, and for a fleeting moment she could feel the weight of its eyes upon her, like cold, unfeeling hands gripping her soul. The whispers intensified, forming words now, dark, guttural sounds that clawed their way into her mind. "You shouldn't have come here, Lila." Her name echoed around the room, an accusation, a warning. The shadow moved again, its limbs elongating, stretching unnaturally, like a spider inching closer to its prey. It was faster now, its form snapping from one place to another in a sickening, jerky motion. Lila stumbled backward, her body trembling as panic set in. She reached for the wall behind her, but her fingers grazed only dust and decay. There was nothing solid, nothing to hold on to. Her thoughts raced, desperately trying to find a way to escape, but everything around her seemed like a trap. Her mind flashed to the iron door, the one that had led her into the depths of the mansion. Maybe there was still a chance. She could run back the way she came, find another exit, anything to escape this nightmare. But then, as if in response to her thoughts, the shadow lunged. It was impossibly fast, a blur of darkness that stretched toward her with inhuman speed. The air around her seemed to crackle, the temperature plummeting as the creature closed in. Lila screamed, her voice barely a whisper against the roar of terror that surged in her chest. She spun on her heels, racing toward the doorway, the one she had come through only moments before. Her feet pounded against the stone floor, but the distance between her and the exit seemed to grow longer, as though the room itself were stretching, pulling her deeper into its grip. "You can't leave." The voice was no longer a whisper. It was a roar, a chorus of voices twisted together in a cacophony of rage and malice. The walls around her seemed to pulse, the shadows growing thicker, more suffocating. The door was close now, so close, but it felt like it was miles away. Her lungs burned as she gasped for air, her legs heavy and unresponsive, as if the very house itself was holding her in place. The coldness enveloped her, creeping under her skin, filling her with a dread she couldn't escape. Suddenly, she felt it, a cold hand on her shoulder. Lila froze. The touch was light, almost gentle, but it burned like ice. She didn't need to turn around to know what it was. The shadow had caught her. Her heart thundered in her chest, and for a moment, everything went still. The whispers stopped. The world seemed to hold its breath. Then the hand on her shoulder tightened. A voice, no, multiple voices, whispered directly into her ear. "We are the ones who never left." The words hit her like a physical blow, and in that moment, the last shred of hope she had clung to vanished. The house was alive, but it was more than that. It was something ancient, something that had lived for centuries, feeding off the souls of those who entered its walls. The Blackthorn estate was not just a house. It was a prison, a dark, sentient being that had swallowed the family whole, and now it was coming for her. She wrenched herself free from the grip, staggering forward, her pulse erratic as she sprinted toward the door. Her breath was ragged, her vision swimming, but she couldn't stop. She couldn't afford to stop. The creature's laugh, cold and hollow, rang in her ears as she bolted through the corridor, desperation flooding her every movement. She didn't dare look back, not even when the ground beneath her feet seemed to tremble with the house's anger. But as she reached the door, she realized something horrifying, something that stopped her dead in her tracks. The door wasn't open anymore. It was gone. The once familiar rusted iron door was no longer there. In its place was a solid, seamless wall, the space where the door had been nothing but smooth stone. The shadows closed in around her. The creature's presence pressed down on her, suffocating and merciless. She was trapped. "You cannot escape." Lila's breath caught in her throat as the truth settled over her like a blanket of ice. There was no escape. The mansion had claimed her, just as it had claimed all the others before her. In that moment, she realized with sickening clarity that the Blackthorn estate wasn't just a house. It was a tomb. And now she was part of its collection. The last thing she saw before the darkness overtook her was the figure in the corner, its faceless mask tilted slightly, as if it were smiling. And the whispers continued, louder than ever before. You are ours now. Chapter 9, The Endless Night. The world around Lila was a blur, a nightmare made real, a twisted, suffocating fog that gripped her mind and soul. Every inch of her body screamed in pain, her limbs heavy and cold, her skin burning with the chill that radiated from the walls. She was aware of nothing but the crushing, oppressive weight of the darkness that surrounded her, swallowing her thoughts whole. It felt like an eternity. But was it truly time that passed, or had the mansion itself become a prison, bending and warping everything it touched? Lila tried to move, but her limbs refused to obey, as if the very air had conspired to hold her in place. Her eyes fluttered open, but the light was gone. There was no sun, no moon, only the thick blackness, the feeling that she was being pulled into a chasm that had no end. A sound, faint, distant, reached her ears. It was a whisper, but unlike any she had heard before. It was no longer a voice. No, this sound was something worse. It was the sensation of things moving in the dark. Her chest tightened in fear, and instinctively she tried to scream. But her voice was silenced, smothered by the air itself. She was trapped inside her own body, the terror rising up like a choking smoke. It's coming from me, she thought, and the thought was enough to send her heart into a violent, frantic rhythm. But there was nothing to be done. The mansion had taken her. Her body, her mind, it was all slipping away, piece by piece. As the darkness closed in around her, a figure appeared in the distance, faint and shadowed, barely more than an outline. At first, she thought it was a trick of the mind, a hallucination brought on by the fear and exhaustion. But as the figure moved closer, the outline began to sharpen, taking form in a way that was undeniably real. A woman. Lila's breath caught in her throat. She didn't know why, but there was something about this woman that made her heart race in a way that had nothing to do with fear. It was a strange pull, a connection she couldn't explain. The woman was tall, her features shrouded in darkness, but there was something familiar about her. Her eyes, a cold, piercing blue, were the first thing Lila noticed. They gleamed like shards of ice in the dim light, and as the woman stepped closer, she felt a wave of unease flood through her. There was no warmth in her gaze, only a quiet, haunting emptiness that seemed to go on forever. You've been waiting for me, the woman said, her voice soft, almost too soft, like the echo of a long-forgotten memory. Lila couldn't answer. Her mouth was dry, her tongue thick and heavy. She tried to lift her arms, to move, to do something, anything, but the weight of her body, the weight of the mansion, kept her anchored in place. The woman tilted her head, as if studying Layla, her lips curving into the faintest of smiles. It was a smile devoid of warmth, a smile that promised nothing but sorrow and loss. You're here now, the woman continued, her tone filled with a strange, eerie calm. You've crossed the threshold, and now you'll learn the truth. The words sent a ripple of unease through Lila's chest. The truth? What truth? What could the woman possibly mean? The fire had destroyed everything she had known. The mansion, her family, her life, it was all gone, wiped away by a cruel twist of fate. And now here was this figure standing before her, speaking in riddles. The woman took another step forward, her presence somehow filling the space, pressing in on Lila from all directions. She was so close now, close enough that Lila could feel the cold emanating from her, like the icy fingers of death reaching out to claim her. "You are not the first to come here," the woman said, her voice softer now, almost a whisper. "And you will not be the last. This place, this estate, is not what it seems. It is not just a house. It is a prison, a tomb, and it has been waiting for someone like you." The air seemed to grow colder still, and Lila shivered involuntarily, a chill crawling up her spine. Her eyes locked onto the woman's face, trying to understand, to grasp some fragment of what she was saying, but the words were slipping through her mind, elusive and out of reach. "You've seen it, haven't you?" the woman continued. "The shadow that stalks you. The whispers. They have been calling to you, reaching for you, pulling you deeper into their web. But it's not the mansion you should fear, Lila." The woman's voice grew darker, her eyes narrowing, her gaze seeping into Lila's very soul. "It is what the mansion holds, what it has held for centuries." Lila's breath caught in her throat. A sudden realization struck her like a blow, and the fog in her mind cleared for a moment. The thing in the shadows, the figure she had seen before. The woman smiled again, a cruel, knowing smile. "You've seen it, haven't you? The creature that waits in the depths of Blackthorn Estate. The one that has claimed every soul that has ever stepped through its doors. You will meet it soon enough, Lila. But by then, it will be too late." The woman's words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Lila felt her body trembling, as if the very fabric of the mansion itself was reacting to the woman's presence. What is it?" Lila whispered, her voice trembling. The woman's smile faltered, her eyes darkening with an emotion that Lila could not name. "It is a thing born of fire, of death, a thing that feeds on the souls of the living. It is ancient, and it is endless. The flames you saw, those were just a beginning, a warning. The mansion is not a place of refuge. It is a tomb for the cursed, a haven for those who are already lost." The woman took another step forward, her form blurring, becoming more and more indistinct, like smoke curling into the darkness. "You have two choices now, Lila," she said softly, her voice like a death knell. "You can fight, or you can surrender. But know this, no one escapes Blackthorn Estate. Not alive. Not unbroken." With those final words, the woman's figure dissolved into the shadows, leaving Lila alone once more, surrounded by the suffocating darkness. And as the whispers began again, louder, more insistent than ever before, Lila knew with cold certainty that the nightmare was far from over. It was only just beginning. Chapter 10: The Reckoning. Lila's breath came in ragged gasps as she stumbled through the endless corridors of Blackthorn Estate, her mind reeling with the woman's chilling words. The air was thick with a cold that seeped into her bones, and every step she took felt heavier than the last. The mansion seemed to stretch and twist before her eyes, an oppressive maze that taunted her with its dark secrets. She had reached the heart of it now. She could feel it, the presence that had haunted her every waking moment since her return. The shadow in the corners of her vision, the whispers that tugged at her sanity, the cold fingers that had brushed against her skin. They were all drawing closer, pulling her towards something far worse than she could have ever imagined. She had to confront it. She had to face whatever waited in the depths of this cursed place. Her footsteps echoed eerily through the vast, empty halls, the silence broken only by the sound of her own heart hammering in her chest. She had no choice now. No more running, no more hiding. This was it. The mansion seemed to come alive around her. The walls groaned as if they were breathing, and the floors creaked under her weight, sending waves of unease through her. She pressed on, her resolve hardening. She had to end this. She had to stop whatever had been unleashed in this place before it consumed her too. At the end of the corridor, a door stood before her, its dark wood stained with age and time. It looked like any other door in the mansion, but Lila felt it calling to her, as if the very walls were whispering her name, urging her forward. This was the final threshold, the point of no return. Lila reached out and gripped the cold, tarnished handle. Her fingers trembled, but she forced herself to steady her breath. She had come too far to turn back now. With a deep breath, she pushed the door open. The room beyond was a vast, circular chamber. The air was thick with dust and decay, the walls covered in dark, peeling wallpaper that seemed to pulse with an eerie, unnatural life. In the center of the room stood an altar, an ancient stone structure, its surface stained with something dark and sinister. And there, kneeling before the altar, was the thing. It was not human. It never had been. Lila could feel it in the very marrow of her bones, a sense of ancient, otherworldly malevolence that radiated from the creature like an unbearable weight. Its form was a shifting mass of shadow, its features indistinct, like a patchwork of nightmares made flesh. Eyes glowed from within the darkness, cold and empty, the same piercing blue she had seen in the woman's eyes. The creature's presence pressed in on her, suffocating and consuming, its whispers curling around her mind like tendrils of smoke. She could hear it now, clearly, as if it were speaking directly into her soul. You shouldn't have come back, Lila. This is your end. She swallowed, her throat dry, but she refused to let the terror consume her. She had made it this far. She couldn't stop now. The creature stirred, its eyes turning toward her, and the room seemed to darken further, as if the very light in the world was being swallowed by the malevolence that had taken root here. Its mouth opened, revealing rows of jagged, blackened teeth, and it let out a low, guttural growl that vibrated through her chest. Lila took a step forward, though every instinct screamed at her to run. She had to face it. She had to end this. "Leave me in peace," she whispered, though her voice was barely audible over the growing noise of the thing's whispers. The creature's laugh echoed through the chamber, sharp and cold. "Peace? There is no peace here, little girl. There is only the eternal darkness. The fire you saw, that was only the beginning. This estate has fed on your ancestors, and now it feeds on you. You cannot escape." A cold sweat broke out on Layla's forehead, but she stood firm. She had come too far to back down. "I won't let you in," she said, her voice growing stronger, steadier. "I won't let this place claim me." The creature's eyes narrowed, its form shifting and writhing like smoke in the air. "You think you have a choice? You think you can stop me? I have been here long before you, and I will remain long after you're gone." With a sudden shrieking roar, the creature lunged toward her, its shadowy form moving with unnatural speed. Lila's heart stopped, but instinct took over. She spun on her heel, running toward the altar. The room seemed to stretch and twist as she moved, her feet slipping on the cold stone floor. She had to reach the altar. She had to end this. As she neared the stone structure, she saw the faint outline of something etched into its surface, an old symbol, worn by time, but still recognizable. It was a sigil, one that pulsed with an energy that felt both ancient and wrong. She didn't know why, but she felt it was the key. It was the only way to stop the creature, to end the nightmare. Without hesitation, she reached out and pressed her hand against the symbol. The room exploded in a flash of blinding light. The creature screamed, its form disintegrating into a whirlwind of shadows that howled in pain and rage. Layla staggered back, shielding her eyes from the light, her body trembling with exhaustion. And then, just as quickly as it had come, the light faded. The creature was gone. The room was silent. Lila collapsed to her knees, her body shaking with the after effects of the blast. The weight of the mansion's presence lifted, as if the very walls had exhaled a long-held breath. The oppressive darkness that had clung to her soul seemed to dissipate, leaving only an eerie stillness behind. The mansion was quiet now, too quiet. Layla looked around the chamber, the altar still standing, the sigil fading from its surface. She had done it. She had faced the creature and destroyed it. But as she rose to her feet, a single thought crept into her mind, one that she couldn't shake, no matter how hard she tried. Had she really defeated it, or had she merely done its bidding, unknowingly sealing her fate? The door behind her creaked open, and Lila turned, her heart skipping a beat. Standing in the doorway was the figure of the woman, the same woman who had warned her, who had guided her. And she was smiling. "You did it," the woman said, her voice as cold and emotionless as ever. "But it's not over, Lila, and never will be." Lila's breath caught in her throat. "What do you mean?" I stopped it." The woman's smile widened, but it was a cruel, hollow thing. "You think you're free?" "No, child. Blackthorn Estate is a prison, and you're still inside it. The shadow you killed, it was only one piece of the puzzle. You can never leave." "Not really." Layla's heart sank as the woman stepped forward, her eyes gleaming with something dark and unfathomable. The light from the room flickered and dimmed, and the shadows began to creep back into the corners of her vision. And then, in the silence that followed, Lila understood. The mansion had never let her go. It had only been waiting,